And as I teased last week, or hinted at, we're approaching some of the most offensive verses, for lack of a better word. At least as far as our culture is concerned, they're not actually offensive. No Scripture should ever be offensive to anybody who cares about the Scriptures and what they are and who they come from. But as far as being inconsistent or incompatible with our culture today, this is it. One of a couple of places in the New Testament. Because here's how verse 11, we got to verse 11. But actually, before we do that, in chapter 2, we talked about how Paul says, first of all, and then he's going to get into what we have been using as sort of our grand thesis for 1 Timothy, that you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God. So now, beginning in chapter 2, verse 1, he starts talking about that. And he talks about prayers. And then, finally, he gets in verse 7, verse 8, about leading in prayer. The men are to do that. And then the women adorning themselves in respectable apparel, with what is proper for women who profess godliness with the good works. And then he says this: let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I've got the other verse up there. Probably should have separated those because we're not going to dive into verse 12 just yet. Initial reactions, anybody?
Is this talking about in worship?
Yep. He's still talking about, again, in verse 8, he's clearly talking about leading. The first few verses is, prayers in general be made, but then he clearly gets more in detail of the males, doing the praying, at least in the leading of the prayer, and then the way that the women ought to adorn themselves in the assembly. So he's clearly talking about, he doesn't say in the assembly, but it's pretty clear, especially whenever we take into consideration chapter 3, verse 15, about knowing how to behave in the household of God. But we also made the point that, people should, women and men alike, should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, no matter where they are. But there's clearly an assembly context based on the context. So let a woman learn. Here's the first thing that we want to notice, that is more or less a command already. Women are expected to learn. Now, that may seem like a no-brainer, but that's not the case in many cultures. Women aren't allowed to learn. Even today, not just ancient cultures. There's some cultures today. Women aren't allowed to drive. Women aren't allowed to be educated. You know why? Because I guess an educated woman is a threat of some kind. But not in Christianity. Women are encouraged, if not commanded, to learn. So many times, most people would take this verse and be all caught up on the fact that he says quietly and with all submissiveness, and totally miss the fact that he's in the midst of this, he's encouraging or even commanding women to be educated.
And also, I just go to not being a leader in the church, because if you're not the preacher or the song leader.
Well, we haven't gotten there yet. So who's to say that a woman can't do that? Yeah, we'll get to that. Next word, quietly.
We should ask Jo what she thinks about this verse.
Well, then we probably won't even get to verse 15 if we do that. But anybody's Bible say something different than quietly? In silence. sounds a lot more stern, doesn't it? In silence. What is silence? As far the way we use that word.
No sounds.
No sound at all, right? If you do something in silence, it's almost, in our current vernacular in English, the way we would use it, silent and quiet are not even the same thing, are they? You can do something quietly that's not silent, right? Well, yeah. Well, here's the thing. The Greek word there that's used there means a state of quietness without disturbance is one definition, and then there's another definition, a secondary definition that means say nothing or very little, and can be translated silence. This word is used only 3 other times in the New Testament. One of them is in the next verse, and there's one in Acts 22, verse 2, and in 2 Thessalonians 3:12. And there are some indicators that let us know that Paul does not mean absolute silence. For instance, is there a time or a circumstance in which women are expected to not remain silent?
When
Singing. I should have said in the assembly if I didn't. So a time when in the assembly a woman is expected not just to not be, the exact opposite, is expected not to be silent. And that's in singing, right? If a woman was supposed to be utterly silent in the assembly, then you women would not be allowed to sing. But all Christians are commanded to sing in the worship assembly, and therefore it can't be that Paul is saying that women are to be utterly silent in the assembly. But there's a good example, I think, in Acts chapter 11, verse 18. It's not the exact same Greek word, but it's a form of the word. It more or less, to our eyes, it's the same word. In Acts 11, verse 18 is when Peter is telling the Jews, or the Christians rather, in Jerusalem about Cornelius' house, what happened there. So Cornelius was converted in Acts 10. In Acts 11, he goes and reports it to the church. And in verse 18, it records their response to this. It says, when they heard these things, they fell silent.
ASB says held their peace.
Okay. Fell silent, held their peace. Note what are the very next words though? They fell, or they. In fact, there might be a translation that says they were silent. Maybe. Before we even look at the next phrase there, I want to see if I can find that. If a translation says that.
Modern King James.
It says what?
They were silent.
Okay. So I bet the King James says that. No, it doesn't. The New King James maybe? Became silent. Okay. So when they heard these things, they became silent. Okay? And then what's the very next thing say? And they glorified God. Saying, isn't that interesting? So they were silent, but then they immediately started speaking.
Well, they stopped talking about what they were originally going to be talking about. They stopped arguing.
That's why I like held their peace, because what does it suggest if somebody holds their peace? What would that normally signify? Okay, they stopped arguing. They stopped with what they were saying before. They stopped in a certain sense. They became silent in a certain sense, but they weren't totally silent because they immediately started glorifying God. So that's just one minor illustration of how it's not utter silence. It doesn't have to be utter silence, but silence in a certain respect. And I think The last prepositional phrase of 1 Timothy 2:11 gives us that respect, that sense. And by the way, this is why the ASV and the ESV are better, I think, in this verse. Quietly. Learn quietly. But if we don't understand that, what he says next helps. With all submissiveness. So it's about being submissive. Submission. Why should a woman be submissive to the men? Well, because God said so. Okay? And Paul's not going to rely simply on this is what God wants or this is what I want. He's going to give even more reasons that some people might find controversial and offensive in itself, but it is what it is. So, if that's not offensive enough, okay, here's what he says in verse 12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Now, the fact that he goes back to remain quiet, to me, even further modifies verse 11. Here's what Paul is talking about. Here's what he means. He kind of goes full circle. Learn quietly, all submissiveness, and as far as that goes, not to have authority over a man, but to remain quiet. So he's saying all the same thing. Now let's break this one down. It is boggling to me that there are people who choose not to acknowledge a verse like this. There are some of our religious neighbors who have experienced rocky roads, recently. I don't mean necessarily in town, but maybe in town, but in other places because of women preachers. Okay, how they've never had women preachers before, but suddenly they've decided it's a time now, 2025. I mean, come on, it's about time we had a woman preacher. What about 1 Timothy 2:12? What is Paul saying? Is this something that that doesn't apply anymore? Well, let's see what he says first. I don't permit a woman to teach. We'll say something about that here in a few minutes. Or to exercise authority over a man. So, according to Paul,
it's probably like teach a man or exercise authority over a man. Like both those things.
yes, yeah, they go together.
Because obviously, mothers can teach their children.
Yeah, here's as I often do. Sometimes the best place to start is let's look at some things that this cannot possibly mean. Before we look at what it might mean and does mean, what can it not possibly mean? First of all, it cannot prohibit a woman from teaching per se, because elsewhere Paul said that mature Christian women should be teachers of that which is good, and that they should train the young women in the things that they ought to be trained in. So that's Titus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. The older women are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, or to train them how to love their husbands and children. Well, if Paul told Titus that the older women are to teach, then why is he now telling the women why is he telling Timothy, I don't permit a woman to teach? Well, because he means something else. He's talking about again, just like with the quiet, he's talking about teaching in a certain respect. Okay? Number two, it doesn't suggest that a woman can never teach a man, even. Can anybody think of an example? Okay. I meant a specific example. Yeah, but that's good. Okay. In Acts chapter 18, Priscilla with her husband, this is I guess, I mean, it's kind of a gray area because he was teaching the wrong baptism, but I take it that Apollos was a Christian man. He was just teaching the wrong baptism. But anyway, how's it worded? Let's see. Took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. That sounds a lot like teaching to me, doesn't it? To you? So, surely Priscilla had something to do with that, and that's why Luke mentioned her there. So, it's not that it will be wrong for a woman to ever teach a man, and somebody said non-Christians. Well, yeah, like a woman converting her husband, perhaps. Christian woman converting her husband. Sure, she can do a lot of that good work with her actions, but you can't convert somebody completely with no teaching. So there's going to have to be some kind of teaching somewhere. And then thirdly, one we already mentioned with the quietly thing, it doesn't even prohibit all teaching by a woman even in the church assembly, because when we're singing, we're teaching and admonishing one another, according to Paul in Colossians 3:16. Okay, so what then does it mean? What is the application here? Almost all conservative commentators and scholars agree that these verses, just like 8 through 10, are about public worship. So, to put it one way, in public meetings where men are present, women are not to teach. Period. Or in any way lord over them, but in contrast, they're to be in quietness, this commentator said. Another one, this prohibition in no way contradicts Titus 2 and 3. It relates to teaching in the church in the presence of men and to the fact that authority in matters concerning the church is not committed to women. Another one said, every form of public address or teaching is clearly forbidden as at variance with woman's proper duties. Another one said, it is upon this verse that the office either of elder, deacon, or evangelist must, in the light of New Testament teaching, be denied to women. Okay, that is clearly what Paul's saying. One other thing. One translation in particular has it worded a little bit differently. It says this. Let me say this first. The word in the ESV that's translated exercise. I think actually I'm not sure what the old ASV says.
But I command not a woman to teach nor to have dominion over a man.
Have, okay, so have. That's what I thought. I knew it said dominion instead of authority, but have or exercise. Now that is a far cry from what the old King James says, which is, it has the word usurp. So I do not permit a woman to teach or to usurp authority or dominion. I don't know which one it says. Over a man. What does usurp mean? The English word usurp. If somebody's a usurper. Take? Okay. What's another word for take? Steal. If someone is a usurper of the throne, it's somebody who took the throne, who has no right to the throne, but took it away. Let me just say this: the word usurp is not in the Greek text. That's an incorrect translation. I think their intentions were in the right place. What the King James translators were trying to suggest was that anytime a woman has authority over a man, she has usurped it, period, no matter what. But what some have taken that to mean is that it's okay for a woman to have authority over a man as long as the men in question gave her that authority. Okay? Because if us men here determined that it was okay for one of you women to take over the Wednesday night class or even preaching some on Sunday morning, well then, in that case, whichever one of you women you haven't usurped the authority, have you? Because we gave it to you. But the word usurp is not there. The word that's translated usurp simply means to have, to exercise authority, to have it. So regardless of how the woman got the authority, the Greek word there simply means to have authority. So it's totally irrespective of how the authority was obtained. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And what he's just said before also. I mean, it wouldn't really make sense if he says, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness, and then instantly says, but she can have authority as long as the men give it to her. No, he doesn't leave any space for that. The point is, what is proper is this. The men, just like he said the males were to be the ones leading in prayer, males are to lead in teaching, in any position of authority. Whenever we get to the next chapter, for qualifications of elders, one of those qualifications is to be the husband of one wife. Well, that already rules out women, because clearly only a man can be the husband. I guess in today's society, a woman can have a wife, but she's not going to be a husband, because that's a masculine word, and he uses masculine pronouns throughout the whole thing. But anyway, now here's the next question. How do we know that this is not just a cultural thing? There's the big question. This is just something that's limited to Paul's culture in the first century in Ephesus and under Roman rule. This is the way it was. Now in our big time, civilized, enlightened society where we've liberated women, we've liberated women to be as bad as the men, apparently. It's different. This isn't the way we operate anymore. So it's only cultural. Well, verses 13 and 14 totally blow that out of the water. Because Paul's argument has nothing to do with their culture. He takes it all the way back to creation. And here's his argument. Whether we can fully comprehend why this argument is appropriate, it is the argument Paul, inspired of the Holy Spirit, used. He says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. There's argument number one. Why is this the way it is? Because Adam was formed first, then Eve. Number two, verse 14, Adam was not deceived. Actually, let me back up. I forgot 1 Corinthians 11, 8 and 9. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. So similar argument he's making there in 1 Corinthians 11. Now the second one is, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So two arguments. Adam was formed first, and based on 1 Corinthians 11, where I just read, Eve was not just formed after Adam. She was made for Adam to be a helper to him, not to usurp his authority or to exercise authority over him, but to be a helper to him and submit to him under his godly leadership. But also, and this is the one that some people might stumble over, Adam wasn't deceived. Now, I know a lot of women who would be tempted maybe, and even Christian women, who would get defensive and want to launch an attack on Adam. almost questioning Paul's argument.
Well, he was influenced by Eve, but he wasn't deceived by the serpent.
Yeah. Well, Adam was even worse because
He did it.
he, whatever. So basically trying to say Paul's argument is null and void because what Adam did was even worse.
But
Because,
that doesn't even matter because he was made first.
yeah, that's true. But here's the thing. Adam was not fooled by the serpent's deceit, but Eve was. You see, that's the argument he's making. He doesn't say that Adam didn't do anything wrong there because he did, and the Genesis record makes it very clear. He sinned. He did the same thing ultimately Eve did. He ate the fruit. But one thing that Adam did not do was get deceived. Therefore, if Adam, when you look at it this way, what ended up happening in the Garden of Eden was Eve exercised authority over Adam. And he let her lead him in that instance, which happened to be the worst possible thing he could have done because she led him to basically destroy the world with that sin. So here's another argument that I could see people making. Well, that doesn't mean every woman would do that. I wouldn't do that. Just because Eve did that doesn't mean I would do that.
Well, we're all sinners.
That's beside the point, that argument is. Because
It's part of our punishment.
Paul says, this is the way God intends it to be. Now, if somebody wants to try to argue with God, on Judgment Day or whatever, and say, I really don't like that you punish all of us women just because Eve was deceived. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it reflects a deep understanding of the failures of men and women. Adam's failure was that he was not the leader he should have been.
Yeah.
Eve's failure was that she thought that she needed to contend with what was offered in the
Mm-hmm.
and so she was deceived. And that's inherent in all women. Like for men, it's always inherent in the struggle is to stand up for what you should
Yeah.
and be the leader. And so this defends against that natural proclivity, and also by putting men in charge of the eldership, it forces them to learn against their weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Because women are often more willing to take on those roles and can, in many cases, do as well or better. But that's not the way God wants it. So
Yeah. And God would know. So it's also not to say that men are perfect. And that it's also not to say that men can't be deceived. Because men can be deceived. Paul doesn't say men can't be deceived, but women can easily be deceived, and therefore women ought to submit to men, and women shouldn't be teachers. But having said that, I wouldn't miss the connection between being deceived and teaching. Isn't it true that the worst person that you would want to be a teacher is one who is operating under some sort of deception?
But I will say there are plenty of males teaching in different churches that are clearly deceived.
Yeah.
And leading many astray. Not that doesn't have anything to, I'm just saying, sadly,
Yeah.
males started Islam and, all these different, Mormonism, all these different deceived.
Yeah. Because they were corrupt and had ulterior motives in that. But Paul's argument, this is what it is. And this was the way God intended to be, always.
And it wouldn't be so offensive now in our culture if we raise, it's like a taboo thing now, but to raise children to lean into their gender roles, to understand that innate differences between males and females and that.
Yeah, that it's not
strengths and that
it's not degrading to a woman, to a young woman, to be submissive to her male counterparts in society. It's supposed to be an entirely societal thing. It's not just husbands and wives, but men and women, period. Paul says there is an order, a divine order in creation. trying to find the verse. I thought it was in Ephesians 5. But it's, God or the Father, you might say, Christ, man, woman. The head of the woman is man, the head of man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. That's what Paul said. I can't find the verse, but it's in there somewhere. It's not where I thought it was. But that's an order of creation. And I'll just read this comment from Kaufman. He said, Adam's being the first form gave him priority in creation. Furthermore, Eve was created as his assistant and helper, one suitable for him. And if both Adam and Eve had respected this God-given arrangement, the human family might still have resided in the Garden of Eden. The disaster came when Eve became the leader instead of the helper. When Eve became the leader instead of the helper and led her husband into the tragic fall of the entire race. So that is really what happened in the Garden of Eden is she took the lead. And yes, Adam let her. There's kind of that speaks to that whole, as long as the men give her the authority. But anyway, why is this not cultural? Well, because look at it this way. Paul was farther removed from Adam and Eve than he is from us in time. It may not feel like that, but he was a lot more, actually. So if somebody today says our culture is nothing like what his culture was 2,000 years ago, well, you think the first century culture in Ephesus in the Roman Empire was anything like the culture of the Garden of Eden 4,000 or whatever years earlier? So their cultures were farther apart than our cultures are. So clearly has nothing to do with culture. And we already made the point earlier in verse 8 that he says, I desire then that in every place, everywhere, this is the way it ought to be. So it has nothing to do with culture, has nothing to do with time, because the principle is grounded in the creation of man and woman itself. So, so back to 1 Corinthians 11 then. Head of every woman is man, head of every man is Christ, head of Christ is God.
Well, this is the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is her wife is her husband, and the
Okay. So just the other way around. But yeah. Well, anybody have anything else on that? Because it's about to get even more confusing. Okay, well, then it is going to get confusing then. Because this is the hardest part of the whole chapter. And the hard part about this one is there's not really any 100% certain answer. But here's what he says. Yet, she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. I say it's the most confusing verse of this whole chapter. It's one of the most difficult verses in the whole Bible, to be honest. Because, not because it's just nobody can even understand the words that he's saying, but there are some question marks with some pronouns, for one thing. Like this. Who is she in this verse? What does he mean by childbearing? And especially, the hardest one is, who is they? So, here's the thing. Let's do what we did before. One thing that we can be sure that this verse does not teach, because it cannot teach it, is that simply bearing children has anything to do with a woman's personal salvation from her own sin. Right? There's no way that can be true. There's no way that can be what Paul is saying. If so, then you women, most of you women, have it a lot easier than us men, because we can't even do that. So, if all you have to do is bear children to be saved, well, that seems a little contradictory to the rest of the New Testament. But here's the other thing. What about women who can't bear children? Well, then they have no hope. So clearly, Paul is not saying that bearing children, the simple act of having a baby from your body, has anything to do with her personal salvation from her own sin.
But a woman did bear a child, that did save the world.
Okay, so there are three plausible theories here as to what this verse might mean. The first one is called the redemptive plan through Christ theory. And what it says is, she is Eve, not women, but Eve. And child in childbearing is a reference ultimately to Jesus. And they are all those who are saved in Christ by obedience to the gospel. That's one theory. I'm not saying that is the most likely, but that is one plausible. That could work. Theory number two is the woman's deliverance from the temptation to usurpation theory. And that is that Paul is addressing, is that long enough for you? Paul was addressing specific matters in Ephesus, and that, I'll just read this quote. Paul appears to be saying that by assuming the role of mother and homemaker, a strong and aggressive woman may be delivered from the sin of usurping authority in the church. So, maybe there were some women in Ephesus that were very overbearing and insubordinate. And Paul is saying, if you will assume your, not just God-given role, but blessed role of being a woman, a mother and a homemaker, it can save you from yourself in a way. Okay, so that's one theory. And the third theory is the woman's ideal fulfillment view, which is that childbearing here stands for really the totality of woman's domestic role. So it's not just having a baby, but everything that goes with that of motherhood and wifehood, if you will, wifedom, whatever they call it. And therefore, being a wife and mother is the highest ideal for Christian womanhood. Now, we know that's true in principle. And this is what we've lost teaching young women today, that what is actually best, not just for husbands, not just for the children, but for the women themselves, is if they will fulfill the role of being a wife and mother. We don't do that anymore, do we? As much as we used to. You think anybody in the school system here is encouraging any of those young ladies to be stay-at-home moms? They'd probably get fired. Even if they spoke of it favorably, they'd probably get fired instantly. And that's insane. What do they do instead? What do we do? And by the way, I'm not saying I'm not saying that it's bad for a young woman to get an education. We already talked about that. But what trajectory are we putting all our young women on?
Boss lady, boss independent.
Go to college. Go to college. Become a lawyer, a doctor, whatever. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. It's bad for a woman to be a doctor or a lawyer. But we wonder what's happening with our society and culture. Why is it crumbling? And why is the family crumbling? And we can't put these pieces together? The highest ideal for a woman, and happiness even, and also we have to take into consideration, the depression figures in our American culture nowadays, and suicide and all these things. I think all these things go together. So whether that's what Paul is saying here or not, that principle is certainly true. That the highest ideal for any woman is to be a wife and mother. Now that's not to say that every woman has to be a mother. But that's a blessing to be able to do that. And it perpetuates society, really. And whenever they're godly Christians, you're perpetuating godly society. So it is a difficult verse, admittedly, but that's the third view, which is true either way. So that seems to be sounds good to me. I don't really think theory number 2 is. I think it's the least plausible of them, but it is plausible. But there it is. So in that view, they, I guess, would be the women themselves. Certainly not the children, but the women themselves remaining faithful to that role of wife and mother. Thoughts? Don't be shy, ladies. It's not like we just talked about being quiet or anything.
Well, also, I think the teaching and preaching thing, to look at it, I don't know, maybe it's just a me thing, but that it's, teachers and preachers are judged more harshly. It's a big responsibility, so it's not just something like, I want to be up there, like, I don't want to do it. Like, I don't want that responsibility, so I don't know if, maybe there are women, though, that do, but.
Yeah, there may be some women that don't.
It's not a negative thing necessarily. It's kind of like the men that go to war. Like, I don't want to do it, so I'm thankful that the men are the ones that fight in the military, and I'm thankful that the men are, like, maybe not encourage women not to look at it like it's such a bad thing that we have. Like, there's blessings in our roles.
We ought to be able to do everything the men do. Okay, and then go to war. Hopefully we'll never have another draft. But if we did, my understanding is you ladies will be exempt either way from that. But we've instilled in a lot of young ladies today that being told that they're not allowed to do anything is the number one evil. So even if they don't want to do it, I don't want you to tell me I can't do it. So I'm going to do it anyway. But it has nothing to do with women it doesn't mean women are stupid, like they're not smart enough to be teachers. It has nothing to do with that or anything like that. There are many of the brilliant minds of humanity happen to be female minds. But what we're talking about is God's word and will. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to send mothers and daughters into a meat grinder.
Yeah.
There's better things for them.
Yeah. Better things such as raising children. Yeah. See, here we go. There we go back to it. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So what began as an honorable thing and a thing that is an honor and compliment to women has been flipped around to be an insult to women, which that is what we're living through, is the upheaval and the turning upside down of everything traditional and right.
To the point that we're like, we can kill our babies.
Yeah, to the point of we ought to have the right to kill our babies if we want, because we want to be able to go around and have sex with whoever we want and not have to worry about the consequences. Yeah. They actually can't. They won't let them. So like I said, encouraging young women to find a good husband and to, fulfill or pursue motherhood and being a good wife. And how have we let it happen that that is downgrading to a woman to get to be the homemaker when actually that's her highest ideal potential. Also for happiness. For happiness. And I think studies are pretty decisive on that.